the goal for the hour is we're going to spend about 45 minutes talking through tips for managing the performance of remote workers, which I know is the reality of your world at this point. Many of you may have never had remote workers before, but all of a sudden you have all remote workers. So adjusting to that and making sure that you're effectively managing performance is something that I'm sure is top of mind for you. So we will spend time talking through tips that relate to that topic. And we will wrap up with about 15 minutes of question and answer. So as it relates to our tips that we're going to focus on, I'm going to offer to you 6 tips. And they are: set expectations, meet regularly, give timely feedback, ask for status updates, build trust with your direct reports, and avoid annual review surprises. So when you think about managing performance of remote workers, what's interesting is the tips are very much the same as compared to managing performance of workers that are in the office with you. The difference is, as a manager, you have to be much more intentional about ensuring that you consistently adhere to performance management best practices and that you leverage these tips that we're going to talk about today. But also, as a manager, it's easy to fall into the trap of, frankly, just getting really busy with other stuff and becoming disconnected from the day-to-day output of your employees. One item I want you all to know before we go through these tips is that I am definitely not disconnected from the reality of what your world looks like right now. So many of these tips, ideally, would be implemented right up front before an employee moves into remote work mode. Unfortunately, in the situation that we've been faced with in 2020, what has happened is you have almost overnight gone from a workforce that worked in an office to now a workforce that works at home. And as a result of that, you're playing catch up a little bit. And not only that, but this transition happened mid performance review cycle. So what I say to you is, as we go through these tips, do the best you can for this current performance review cycle. But think about how you can make the process much smoother for the upcoming review cycle. And I'll give you some ideas about, how to implement some immediate items that will make this review cycle a little bit better, even though it's a little unusual. And then how to think longer term about putting processes and structures in place that will be better for the future. So we are starting with tip number 1, and as we go through these slides, you will see each of the tips as the header on the slides, and they are the same ones that I introduced at the beginning. So tip number 1 is to set clear expectations. And as we walk through each of these tips, I'm going to offer you some ideas on how to help you implement those within your shop with your direct reports. So as public employees, those of you who work in the Commonwealth of Virginia, one of the tools in your toolbox is the employee work profile, and that's referred to as an EWP. And what that does, that document, it really serves as a foundational document for performance management because it contains both a work description and a performance plan. And really, that same document is the performance appraisal for your employees. That document is not universal. So if you have employees coming to you from other organizations outside of the state, most likely they're not going to be familiar with the employee work profile. They're probably going to be more familiar with 2 separate documents, a job description and a performance appraisal form. So the first tip that I would offer right now in 2020 is that if you hire someone new, pretty immediately take some time to introduce the employee work profile form to your employee and work together to make sure that the content within that EWP form really does, 1, provide a good description of the work, but 2, really does lay out what the performance expectations are related to the job. The second thing that I would offer to you as it relates to setting clear expectations and using the employee work profile form for that is I'm certain that because all of a sudden you've had workers who used to work in the office that have now transitioned home, that the current employee work profiles that are associated with each of your workers may not have every aspect of that that makes sense now in the remote environment, meaning that some of the descriptors just may not be able to be accomplished in a remote environment. Some of the ways that you all envision assessing performance may not be able to happen as a result of the remote work. So what I would recommend is before the review cycle, which I know is coming up pretty soon, when you'll be delivering that annual review, take a moment to prompt your employee to look at their EWP and to submit to you recommendations of changes and edits that would relate to items that would no longer make sense as it relates to their job description and their performance expectations because they're remote. And that shouldn't be a lot in the EWP, but it's definitely going to be some content. So I'll give you an example. When I worked in state government and I served in that regional HR role that was mentioned during my introduction, one of my core responsibilities, actually 50% of my review, was based on consultant support to colleges. And if you read my EWP around that, both in my description of work as well as in my performance appraisal, one of the things that was mentioned was that I was accountable for performing on-site visits to the colleges that I support. Well, in the 2020 new norm, I would not be able to provide the on-site support that once was the norm, but I would certainly still be expected to provide support remotely. So just tweaking that language in the EWP before the annual review so that I am held accountable to what I can deliver at this point would be a really good practice and a good way to set that clear expectation and ensure that both me and the manager are on the same page as to how I'll be reviewed for the year. So that's really your short-term implementation as it relates to your EWP. Longer term, as soon as you get through the review cycle for this year, what I would recommend is that you look at the EWP after that review cycle with your employee, again, letting your employee have an active role in that process, and determine if there's any longer term changes that you want to make to that EWP that would set the stage for the upcoming review cycle. So right now, deal with the low-hanging fruit, change the things that just have to be changed to make the review cycle make sense. But longer term, look for strategic adjustments that assume that the employee may be in this remote mode for a while, and you want to make sure they are as sufficient as possible, and the EWP aligns with that. Okay, so that's one way to set expectations using the EWP. We're going to roll to the next slide. So as it relates to setting expectations, we've talked about the EWP, which in your environment really is the foundational document that's the beginning point for setting clear expectations. But oftentimes, if you look at that EWP, you may realize that there's still additional information that an employee needs to have to be able to really understand fully what it is that's expected of them. And you as a manager need additional information to be able to assess performance in a way that you can assess it from afar and you can ensure that your assessment is fair. So again, when I was in state government, my EWP, I'm going to go back to that 50% that I was accountable for consultant support to colleges. That was listed on my EWP as a core responsibility. So that appeared as the first line item in my performance review. And in my EWP, the way that that was measured in terms of letting me know how my manager would assess me in that area was through feedback from my clients, through evaluation of work submitted for review and appraisal, and review of progress and accomplishments during check-in meetings with my manager. But what that doesn't necessarily tell me as an employee is, as it relates to that core responsibility, what goals am I supposed to accomplish during the review cycle that's specific to that? So as a result of that being a missing piece, my manager at the beginning of the year, before the review cycle started, sat down, went over the EWP with me, as we've already talked about, and then we together worked on establishing a list of goals using a SMART format that we'll talk about in just a few minutes, that made it very clear for me what it was that I was supposed to accomplish during the review cycle and how I would be measured in terms of my performance. So I'll give you an example. One of the SMART goals that he set in place for me related to consultant support was related to between October 25th, 30th, whenever he did my review, to September 30th, I was expected to perform 3 on-site visits at the colleges that I supported for the purpose of providing education and training to the chief HR officers that I was accountable for serving. So that was using the SMART format because it was specific. It was measurable, meaning that he called out 3 times so he could measure whether I really performed that in the manner that he expected. Did I go out on site 3 times? And it was time-based because I knew that I had to complete that by September the 30th. It was attainable. I had a whole 12-month review period to do that. And it was relevant because it aligned directly back to my expectation of providing consultant support to my colleges. So the point here is not only just to set goals, but when you set them, try your best to not have them be so vague that when you really get down to the brass and tacks of holding folks accountable to those goals, that there's enough gray that the two of you are disconnected in terms of whether the employee met the goal or didn't meet the goal. So the next piece around set clear expectations on the next slide, for purposes of you thinking of ways to implement setting clear expectations, is one step further. You've got your EWP in place, that's your core foundation. You're then going to set some specific goals that align back with those performance measures, so it's very clear what it is that that person is supposed to accomplish during their 12-month review cycle. Now the question is, what other things are you expecting of that employee as it relates to their performance that would affect their overall performance review from you? So in the current remote environment, you know, do you have expectations about their daily schedule and how they service clients? For example, you know, are you okay with them just working an 8-hour day at any point in the day that they wish? Or do you have external clients that expect that individual to be on and ready to serve, you know, at 8 in the morning until 5? You know, can that person take a lunch break? You know, those are things that in the environment that we're currently in, you can't assume that someone knows. So you have to be much more intentional about setting those expectations in a way that it's clear, and that when you go to assess performance, that you're not surprising that person as it relates to expectations that you have around those topics. The other kind of examples that came to my mind related to other things that you can't assume people know is, you know, what is the preferred way to communicate with you? So in the work environment, you know, an open door policy tends to be the norm, which means you can walk in and out of the person's office assuming that they're in there and get support. The period of time that I spent working in the remote environment, in coordination with the manager that I had in the Commonwealth of Virginia workforce, you know, we figured out pretty quickly that the open door policy and the way we used to interact in the remote world was just really difficult to execute. I kind of, as a go-to, every time I needed support, would pick up the phone, because that was more typical as compared to walking into the manager's office. But unfortunately, because I couldn't see was the manager there or not, were they in a meeting, many times I got a voicemail. And for me, that was frustrating as an employee. And for the manager, it was probably frustrating seeing my name light up on the phone when he was in the middle of a Zoom call or something similar. So very quickly, we readjusted expectations in a way that we set the standard to be, when I needed open door support, I would send an email, and I would send it in a way that it was very clear to that manager that that's what I needed, and it required an immediate response. So we agreed on a subject line, and that subject line was support needed in all caps. And that way we were able to still have the flow of communication that we became really accustomed to when we were in the office. Behavioral expectations, the same way. You know, the state of Virginia has code of ethics and has code of conduct documents that obviously all state workers are held accountable to, and you as a manager assess as part of the performance appraisal process. But what other behavioral expectations that are more granular in nature, that are not described in those high-level documents, do you expect of your team? And if those behavioral expectations didn't show up, then you would be discussing that as part of a performance improvement plan. Whatever they are, bring them to the surface. And if you haven't done that already move into remote work, then do that now as soon as you can, so that you can be prepared for holding folks accountable to those expectations. And then the last recommendation that I have, in terms of, again, just not assuming, and ways and places that people can get hung up and kind of off the tracks as it relates to performance management, is setting clear deadlines for required tasks. So related to the SMART goals, you're going to have very clear expectations on longer term things that managers need to accomplish, and you're going to establish that through your goals. But the reality is, there are things every single day that are more of what I refer to as the block and tackle type responsibilities that you expect, I'm sure, as a manager, to be handled in an effective and efficient manner. And if you have a specific thought about, you know, if a client calls and a need appears, that that employee should fulfill that need within, 72 hours, that would be a deadline that you would set for your employee, and find a way to measure that if at all possible, even if that's just your employee providing a status update because you don't have a system in place to review that. The other thing would be, if you have a team meeting and you're asking for some feedback, instead of loosely asking for the feedback, go ahead and put a target date on when you want that feedback to be received. Again, so that you'll be clear on, out in the remote world, how many of your employees really did follow through with that expectation and how many didn't. And it'll give you a chance to hold the folks accountable who missed the mark in terms of giving you that feedback that you had requested by a certain date. So there are some ideas about how you can set clear expectations. If there is only one tip that you implement as it relates to setting you up for effectively managing performance in a remote environment, I would say that it would be this tip. To me, this is the foundation of effective performance management. And, this year, deal with your low-hanging fruit. Deal with making sure that EWP really does make sense in the remote environment. And then put yourself some structure in place that just makes it easier for you to be able to assess those expectations are being met from afar. So we're going to move to tip number 2, and we'll move to the next slide. So tip number 2 is to meet regularly. Once those expectations are set, you're going to want to have ongoing dialogue as it relates to the work that the employee is performing, because that's going to help you keep engaged so that you can effectively manage that employee's performance. So really, that regular meeting ensures that you facilitate feedback and that you build rapport. So a best practice typically is that for new employees, you would meet with employees once a week virtually if possible, so that you can still have the benefit of face-to-face interaction in a virtual world. You can see the smiles, you can read the body language. You're not just solely relying upon communication in the email and phone space. And ultimately, and I just see a comment, I'm going to pause for 1 minute. We are going to send out a copy of the presentation slides as well as the recording. So have no worries. I should have told you that up front. So ultimately, when it relates to meeting with your employees, you want to find a way that you can build that same relationship with the employee that you would ultimately be able to create in that in-person environment. So I highly recommend, if you set up meetings, to do them in a virtual format where you can see faces, see those smiles, read that body language. If your employees are more seasoned, once a week, depending on their workflow, may be a little excessive. So best practices are typically that you meet either bi-weekly or you meet monthly with more seasoned employees. Many times when I talk through this type of recommendation with managers, I may hear a manager say to me, I have hundreds of direct reports. So how in the world could I pull this off in a way that didn't just drown me as the leader? So first of all, my response to that is, I hope that there's no one on this call that has hundreds of direct reports, because that just makes me sad. I feel like most managers are really just unable to effectively manage the performance of employees if they have that many direct reports. The ideal direct report number is somewhere between 10 and 12. I think it's very manageable if you have direct reports 25 and under. So first thing I would say is look at your structure and see if there's any opportunities to reduce your direct reports. Second, if that's just what you're stuck with, then get creative. Find a way to do regular interactions that would be similar to one-on-one interactions in more of a team setting, so that you still get that time to interact with each team member in a way that clarifies expectations and talks about ongoing performance. So on the next slide, I'll give you a recommendation on what maybe a sample agenda may look like. So we're going to assume that you do have a manageable number of direct reports and that you are setting up the one-on-one meeting format, and you're doing it for the purpose of, one, building the relationship, but two, just making sure that all throughout the review cycle, there is ongoing dialogue that helps you manage that performance and helps the employee know where they stand and ensures that that employee is really clear on expectations. So prior to the meeting, the manager and the direct report really should slow down long enough to reflect on the goals and the expectations. But my recommendation is that the employee really bear the greater burden administratively before the meeting versus you as the manager. So have your employee come to the meeting with prepared status updates that direct report can present to you, so you know how things are progressing as it relates to the expectations that you've set and the goals that you've set and that you and the employee have agreed upon. Have the direct report kind of lead the conversation around what's going well for them. So, what are things that they've accomplished that they're proud of? What, related to your expectations, do they think that they're really nailing? And the flip side of that, what's not going so well from their perspective? So, do they feel like they've dropped the ball in a certain instance? Any performance expectations that they're struggling to achieve? And as that direct report goes through what's going well, what's not going well, you as the manager, just by being in tune with what's happening in terms of having regular meetings with that direct report, will be in a position to chime in and offer additional kudos of what's going well, and maybe have the opportunity to provide some recommendations on how to improve performance as well. And then close the meeting with what support or resources does that direct report need, either from your perspective or from their perspective, but let them lead that discussion and then you chime in with additional resources. Normally, one-on-one meetings of this nature, somewhere between 30 minutes to an hour. You want to have it loose enough that there is some time for whatever else might be on your mind or the direct report's mind. But this tends to be a great agenda to follow to just keep that dialogue going and to have it specific to performance. So the next slide is perfect timing. We just had that flip for us. So ultimately, when it relates to giving timely feedback, this is going to be tip number 3 for you. We're moving past the regular meetings and we're giving timely feedback. Related to performance, we want to make sure that we are constantly sharing what's on our mind as it relates to that employee's performance. And this is hard. I get it. I've been a leader for years. The realities of the workplace make it so that many times you feel like you're fighting fires and you just can't rise above that to be able to provide proactive feedback. I totally understand. But the reality is, as proactive as you can be with providing feedback, do it, because it's going to allow you to effectively manage performance, and it's going to create just a better relationship and a happier environment for the employee and for you. So the first thing I would say related to implementing given timely feedback is really, from your perspective, get your mind around the difference between formal feedback and what I refer to as just-in-time feedback, or on the spot, I've heard people call feedback. So formal feedback in your environment tends to be, like an acknowledgement of extraordinary contribution form that gets created, a notice of improvement needed, or a substandard performance form. Maybe it's a probationary progress review. Maybe it's an interim evaluation form, a written notice form, or even the annual review itself. So if things surface that would constitute the need for one of those formal forms to be completed, then you kind of, as a manager, have to take action on that, and that is formal feedback. The just-in-time and on-the-spot feedback is going to be all the other stuff that happens that doesn't necessarily require the written form, but it's great feedback that the employee needs to know and that you as a manager want to be able to offer. So in the case of just-in-time feedback, you're going to want to provide both positive and negative feedback. So, on the, customer service type job, if you have your employee provide a status update, and in that status update, you have that employee tell you about a client interaction where the client was so pleased, or you even get an email from a client directly about how pleased they were with how Suzy Q helped them, then as soon as possible, immediately slow down and send that person a kudos, or on the spot when you're talking to them, let them know how much you appreciate that, and reiterate and reinforce how that aligns back to your expectations. Related to negative or corrective action, just-in-time feedback, within 24 hours, when something that is misaligned with your expectations happens, you really need to have an immediate on-the-spot conversation about it, even if that corrective action item requires one of those formal forms. You don't want to wait until you get your form together, because it's an administrative process for you, and many times it's going to take multiple days to get that together. And in the meantime, time is passing, the incident isn't fresh in the mind of the employee, and as a result of that, you are running the risk of that formal action form being presented to the employee in a way that surprises them. So the best way to handle that is you may not know all the answers at that point, but reach out to the employee, let them know, the incident that you're aware of that from your perspective aligns with a misalignment of your expectations. And, if you're not sure yet about whether it warrants a corrective action form that's formal or not, then use that just-in-time feedback interaction to ask that employee for their perspective or information that they may have about the incident so that you can assess more fully what action is appropriate. If at the end of that conversation you're still not really sure, but you think after you do some additional investigative work and thinking that there may be a corrective action form that surfaces, in that conversation with simply being transparent and saying, you know, I've enjoyed our interaction today. I thank you for the feedback. You know, I really want to stress that this particular action that happened does not align with my, you know, the expectations that we've established and agreed to. And, you know, I'm gonna go back and kind of assess and take into consideration the information that you shared with me. You know, I'm going to look at other information if that's available and helpful. But it is likely that I will circle back and deliver to you a notice of improvement needed, a written notice form, you know, something of that nature. And I will do that by next week. And that way you've been transparent. There's no surprises, but you've also had the benefit of being able to talk to the person about the incident very quickly after it happened. But you're always, when it relates to corrective action, if it warrants that type of formal form, gonna want to do both. You know, you don't want to use just your just-in-time feedback if it's something that does require documentation and something that you want to continue to make sure that you hold folks accountable to so that you don't have repeat incidents. So on the next slide, again related to given timely feedback, in the remote environment, one of the recommendations that I have for you is, you know, always slow down when you have something that happens that you think warrants either positive feedback or the corrective, negative type feedback, and prioritize what feedback message and format is going to be most effective. So I say that because in the remote environment, what's going to be really easy and natural for you is to have email be your go-to, kind of no matter what, whether it's positive feedback or it's negative feedback. But really choose your communication format really wisely, depending on the type of feedback. So, you know, something quick that's positive, email may be perfect. A really big positive thing that really helps to reinforce expectations that you and your manager, you and your employee have agreed upon. You know, you may want to slow down and have a phone conversation about that, have a Zoom conversation about that, especially if it's a positive win in an area where an employee has previously struggled, because you really want it to hit home that they're on the right track and you want to reinforce that positive behavior. If it's negative, I would say stay away from the email. Try your best to have that Zoom call again so that you can see the face, you can read the body language, you can make a connection. There's no opportunity for misinterpretation. And if it is, you'll have a chance to catch it and be able to kind of correct that misinterpretation along the way. During those types of conversations, and they're hard when they're virtually, they're even hard in person, I get it. You know, one of the ways that you can kind of get a feel for whether or not the employee is taking in what you're saying and the way that you're saying it is ask that employee to repeat back what they heard. And that gives you a chance to correct and kind of reframe the message so that that person really does walk away with your version of what the message was intended to be. But in all of those instances, be really clear and specific about what's going well and what's not going well. And in general, use the best practice that if you're praising, to do that publicly is normally fine. You have an employee every once in a while that's really super shy, and hopefully you know them well enough to know that if you in a team meeting make a big deal about them, that it'll embarrass them. And in that case, that's probably the one instance where praising publicly for performance may not be the best practice, but most of the time people are fine with that, and praising publicly is perfectly acceptable. But that constructive criticism, never take a chance to do that publicly, always do it privately. And as it relates to effective performance management, especially in a remote environment where you have to work a little harder to keep that trust and have the relationships intact. Make sure that you don't fall in the trap of having a generic corrective action statement to an entire team simply because one person got off the rails a little bit. Address that with that one person directly and do it in a one-on-one conversation so that that person really understands where they went wrong and how they can take action to correct that or just not have that type of behavior appear again. And then you don't have the really good performers in your group wondering, was it me? Most of the time, you're most conscientious, and your highest performers, if you take the approach of having general corrective feedback in a public setting, are going to be scared that they did something wrong. And that's definitely going to not be the way that you want to motivate your top performers. You want to ensure that they know that they're performing well and that they are, exceeding your expectations. So no false messaging there. Okay, so that's our tip number 3 around giving timely feedback and some recommendations on how you may do that. So we're going to move to the next slide, and that's going to start us with tip number 4, which is asking for status updates. So if you put in place the one-on-one meeting recommendation that we talked about earlier, you may find that the one-on-one meetings are frequent enough that you're getting the timely feedback as the tip that we talked about recommended. And in that case, status updates can really be handled during that meeting, and you don't need another form for status updates. But if you have a seasoned employee, and let's say you choose to have one-on-one meetings only once a month, and the nature of the work that they do flows faster than that, you as a manager, especially in a remote environment, you want to find a way that you can keep the finger on the pulse of kind of what's happening, what progress is being made. So you may want to create a different opportunity for that direct report to share with you status updates, whether that's a weekly email, maybe as part of your team meetings, you have a process within the team meetings that each person shares, status updates that have occurred during the week, and you kind of do that as a round robin. But ultimately, really ask yourself, am I getting the information in a timely manner that will allow me to know, one, kind of what work is being accomplished within the group, and two, is that work that's being accomplished meeting the expectations? And if not, then I'm in a position to be able to effectively address that. I'm also, if it's meeting expectations, in a great position to be able to reward that behavior and celebrate that behavior in a timely manner. Okay, so that's around ask for status updates, and a way that if you feel like you're not getting enough timely updates through your one-on-ones, that you could put another mechanism in place for that. So we're going to move to the next slide, which is going to allow us to introduce tip number 5. And tip number 5 is building trust with your direct reports. So this is always important, whether we're in a remote environment or not a remote environment. But in that remote environment, again, building that relationship, especially with an employee that's come new to your team and joins your team in a remote environment, you just have to be more intentional. You have to work harder at it. And the best advice and frame of mind that I would offer to you as a manager related to building trust with the remote workers is really be sure, as best as you can, in this environment, everybody's been pushed home. So maybe not everyone would be a perfect remote employee, but assess whether that employee is self-disciplined enough to control their own productivity and be comfortable without on-site supervision. Today, you're kind of going to have to keep the wheels on the bus even if they're not. So if you figure out they're not, then you're going to need to stick closer to that employee and kind of help them put processes in place that keep the progress going and allow them to get the support that they need it. When the current situation changes, I assume that a lot of people who are working from home may still stay at home. But knowing the people who were really successful and self-disciplined and able to thrive in that environment versus knowing those that aren't are going to help you as a leader make decisions on what portion of your workforce makes sense for you to bring back into an in-person environment. So, you know, knowing where each person is and how effective they are in that remote environment and providing tailored support is important in building trust. The other thing is recognizing that no matter where that remote worker is on the spectrum of being really effective in that space, because they're removed from the day-to-day work environment, they want to feel trusted to do work in the way that they see best, and to not have you kind of have them under your thumb in every moment of the day. So don't micromanage. And I'm going to pause for a moment and let us use the chat box. I'm going to prompt you all to put in some ideas of how you might micromanage, and I'll give you an example to prompt your thinking. You know, when I think of maybe a way that you could micromanage in this remote environment, I think of maybe setting an expectation where every time the employee walks away from their desk, you want them to send you an email. Please, whenever you walk away from your desk, send me an email. You know, there may be a legitimate reason why you want that to happen, and it may really help you as it relates to managing the team. But the impression that that's going to send to your remote workforce is, man, he or she doesn't trust me. Like, must not think I'm doing work, must want me chained to my desk. So that's going to be the types of things to think about in terms of not falling into that micromanagement trap. So if you have any ideas on what micromanaging might look like, please put that in the chat. The next slide is just kind of a reinforcement of this thought. This is a lady, Maura, that's a founder of regainyourtime.com, and I really thought that her quote here was relevant, and it says, to effectively manage remote workers, supervisors must believe, unless they have evidence to the contrary, that people are working even if they are not in the office. And you know, what's required is matrix to refute or confirm anecdotal evidence and personal assumptions. So when you're managing a workforce that you're not seeing every day, you have to give that workforce the benefit of the doubt. And you really have to be thoughtful about the things that you address that are misaligned with expectations, by asking yourself, first of all, was it clear up front? And second, you know, is there any real evidence to prove that the person is off track? Otherwise, you run the risk of damaging that trust because it looks like you're just making assumptions about the person's performance without the ability to really prove that. So I hope that that quote will resonate with you all, and that website is actually really helpful in terms of giving you other thoughts. So the next slide, to kind of wrap up how you recommend and implement building trust, is really in summary when it relates to building trust is, you know, be open and honest. Keep your communication going. So in the remote environment, you have to be more intentional about that. And the best way to do that is to implement those one-on-one meetings, to create a forum for status updates, you know, have team meetings and utilize virtual technology as much as you can. Also, and we talked about this just a minute ago, you know, really go at things with that frame of mind that you want to give the direct reports the benefit of the doubt. Because when you fall in the trap of making those assumptions or kind of arcing to drawing conclusions, then you're gonna just naturally damage that relationship and damage that trust. So we're gonna move to the next slide, which is our final tip. And that's tip number 6 here, which is avoid annual review surprises. So again, this is something that as managers, we always have thought about, and we never ever want someone to come to our annual review evaluation session and end up with a face that looks like these 2 kids on this slide. That's not a good thing. And, I'm certain that potentially at some point in your career, you may have had that experience. I know I have. Early in my career, I was in the financial services industry, and I was just kind of starting out with understanding the formalities of customer service, and I was green. I mean, I did the best I could. I'm one of those employees who wanted to please their manager. I've always wanted to meet and exceed expectations, but I didn't know what I didn't know. And as a result of that, I wasn't as smooth on the customer service front as I probably should have been, or as compared to my more seasoned peers. But I went through an entire review cycle, and no one slowed down to talk to me about what I could improve upon or examples of where I wasn't meeting the expectations. And my performance review came, and thankfully I didn't get an overall below contributor rating, but on my customer service section of my performance review, I got a below contributor rating. And it took the wind out of my sails. The manager was correct in assessing that I was not the best at customer service. So that was not at all the issue. The issue was that the more appropriate process would have been to provide me that timely feedback as often as possible through the review cycle, so that I could have the chance to understand where I was going off the rails and how to get myself back on track. And then ultimately, the hope would have been that I would have naturally made those corrections in a way that wouldn't have resulted in any blemish to my performance track record that's formally documented. So as you think about preparing for your annual review process, really ask yourself, is the feedback on this review form that I'm preparing feedback that my employee is fully aware of and would not create a surprise? And in the current environment, I recognize that it's a little harder for you to have all the information that you need to be able to feel like you're fairly assessing and that you're not surprising. So first of all, I would recommend that you ask for a self-evaluation. I know a lot of managers have that in place as a standard practice. But if you don't, ask your employees to take the time to evaluate themselves. That immediately lets you know what they think as it relates to the performance measures that are in place. And it gives you a clue if your mind is going in a completely different direction, that there's a disconnect. And it lets you strategically decide, how you're going to handle, number one, documenting the performance on that form, but number two, actually the performance meeting that you hold with that employee to deliver the performance review. If you feel like there's just information that you're missing that the employee themselves could not give you, and you don't really have any other tools in the toolbox to be able to figure out at this point, whether some of the goals have been met, or, let's say it's a customer service person and you don't have great mechanisms in place to know how well from home they're servicing customers, you may consider the opportunity of obtaining additional feedback from peers, from clients, from key stakeholders as more of like a 360 assessment. If you do that, don't nail that person to the cross as a result of that feedback if you've never ever had that type of feedback incorporated in the annual review process before. So use that as a great coaching opportunity and an opportunity to let them know where they are going off of the rails as it relates to the perceptions of the people that they're serving, and use that to frame your expectations for the upcoming review cycle. But I recommend not necessarily putting you and the employee in a situation where you take all that feedback and you assess the review in a below contributor type of way as a result of what you're getting, because that would create that surprise that we're trying to avoid. And really the big principle here is when you put that form in front of that employee and you hold that annual review session, everything that is on that form and everything that you all talk about really should be a recap of all your previous performance conversations and nothing new. So I always, in the seat of a manager, take one look over that form before I get to that session with the employee and just kind of double check my notes that I've made during the year of all of our performance discussions to make sure that I'm not bringing anything new that would create that face that's on the slide that we don't want to see in that performance session. So that's definitely something that I think is a best practice. If there's only 2 best practices that you put in place as a result of this presentation, number 1 would be take the time to set those clear expectations, because that's going to lay the groundwork for you to be able to effectively manage performance from afar. And 2, just never have those annual review forms have information on them that's a surprise. And in this current environment, when you meet with your employees to deliver their annual review, do that virtually if at all possible, again, so that you can use that formal performance conversation opportunity as a way to build rapport, to be able to see the face, to be able to see that body language, and to be able to have an interaction that's more similar to what we were able to have in the workplace. So that concludes the tips and the ways in which I recommend that you consider implementing those tips within your workplace. So I'm going to transition now to the next slide, which sets us up for taking the next 15 minutes or so. We're at about 12:03, and we're going to wrap up at 12:15, so a little less than 15 minutes. I would just ask you to put in any questions that you have, and I'm going to have Tashawn or someone else from the CMA group to kind of help me determine what those questions are and to be able to answer them for you.
Brett, can you see the questions in the chat box?
Yeah, at this time, if there's any specific questions, please put them in the Q&A or chat box. We have one comment. Kate said it was a great presentation. I would agree.
Oh, thank you so much. And while we're waiting for questions, I see Mary made a really good point. She said, definitely as a manager, you need more than status updates. Need to periodically see actual evidence of work product. And, depending on the employee, you're right on track. So status updates can be just simply a listing of what's been accomplished, or it could be coupled with you actually looking at the work. So yes, right on. Thank you, Mary. That's perfect. Did we do such a great job that we have no questions?
Jennifer, you nailed it. I actually did. I have a question, and just because you asked us to provide some examples of what micromanaging behavior is, and I know in this remote world, one thing that my supervisor has said to us is that we don't manage by the light. We work at DDS. We're under the umbrella of DARS, so we're a little bit unique because we're not on Gmail like everyone. We're on SSA's network, so we've got a different email address, and we can't get on the Gmail. So we use Skype, and what he means is don't manage by light. So it'll show your status if you're available, away, and what we've tried to tell folks is it's more about the results, because our performance measurements are all numerically based. So at the end of the quarter or year, the numbers are going to do the talking. So there's no need to see what times you get here. Were you 2 minutes late? I see you're away for 15 minutes. What were you doing? But what sort of suggestions would you give to us for those that may be working under that type of environment? How do we navigate, broach that subject? I mean, that may be a difficult thing for some of us to have to navigate if we've got a manager who may be a little bit overbearing. How do we open that conversation up without backlash or You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. So definitely framing it from what is the best practice for the manager, is in an environment where workers are what you described, then having more of a hands-off approach is definitely going to just create that better overall relationship. And I think sets the stage for better productivity of the employees because they feel trusted. They feel like they have the flexibility to kind of do the work when the work is appropriate for them to do. And the manager is still well positioned to assess performance because, as you said, there's metrics in place. Hopefully, the expectations have been clearly set. So there's no risk by having that hands off approach that there's going to be negative implications that would come back and haunt the manager. Um, not every manager thinks that way for sure. And not every manager in their career has had the opportunity to manage in that way. And to them, it may feel really scary because they may worry that because they're not comfortable with that style of management, that something's going to go awry and that they're going to have to answer for it. So as the employee, the best recommendation that I can offer is that is an awkward conversation. And how you approach it is going to very much depend on what your relationship with that manager is like. I'm going to kind of assume that the relationship is good enough that you're comfortable having an open conversation. And in that case, I would recommend being transparent and just acknowledging that the way we're working now is really different. And that, this is kind of how you like to approach the world of work remotely, and from your perspective, how that approach of having that flexibility and not necessarily having the manager have the finger on the pulse every moment, from your perspective, really still positions the team well, because these are the evidence points that you kind of have to support that. And ask the manager for their reaction. And if the reaction is, oh my God, no, then hopefully what that does is create the opportunity for some dialogue between the two of you that won't create backlash, that will allow you all to settle on a happy medium. So, again, very much tailored to whether or not you have a good foundational relationship, but definitely a doable conversation and one that I would encourage. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. And actually, there's another question that came from Jennifer DeBrol, kind of similar, I think. It's if you feel like you have a good handle on the performance of your directs, but another manager consistently tries to undermine or question the work effort of your staff with no details, do you have a recommendation on how to handle that?
Repeat that for me one more time, just so I can
Sure.
make sure I offer a good recommendation.
Sure. So if you feel like you have a good handle on the performance of your direct reports, but there's another manager who's consistently trying to undermine or question the work of your staff with no details, what do you recommend to do to kind of navigate that situation?
Sounds like that other manager doesn't have enough to do. What do you think? That's interesting, and that definitely happens. That is the reality, and it seems like that manager is really wanting to play in your sandbox, and that is probably not the most optimal situation because you're the one that's accountable for your team. So I'm always a fan of having open and honest conversations with people, again, depending on the relationship. And my guess is, just based on the question, it may not be the most warm and fuzzy. That conversation is certainly going to be difficult and awkward to approach. But even with that said, what I would recommend is, politely call that manager out for that behavior. Let them know that you're noticing that she or he is pretty consistently kind of wanting to interject themselves into your world, and maybe ask why is that, and how that makes you feel when you have those types of difficult conversations. Do everything you can throughout that interaction to have it be focused on your feelings, and not to use words that would be perceived as an attack on their behavior. There could be a very innocent reason for that person interjecting themselves that you may learn in that conversation that will not make you love it anymore, but will at least help you understand. And hopefully at the end of that conversation, what will happen is a resolution that results in that person getting out of your sandbox. So again, very similar to the other question, it's definitely going to depend on the relationship, but I would not shy away from having that conversation.
One thing I'd just like to note that I thought was interesting that Kevin Vaughn pulled up our chat. He's like, also send the manager the presentation. After that, you know what? I mean, because a lot of us we either volunteer to come to these things or, you know, our managers encourage it. I think it's always good to take that information that we get back and then share that with the team. And then, you know, hopefully maybe that is a way to kind of send a message like, hey, this is the kind of culture we're trying to create.
Yes, and you know, this particular topic, the way that you handle it as a manager has everything to do with the culture that your employees are going to feel. So it is very important to be mindful of how you approach setting expectations and holding folks accountable, because you can unnecessarily create an environment that makes your employees want to run just simply by how you approach that. So please share it with your managers that you think have some opportunities for improvement. Any other questions in the queue? We have about 3 more minutes, I think.
Jennifer, I don't have any other questions in there. Another good presentation comment.
Excellent. Very good. Well, I think my understanding is that there will be feedback requested of you all who attended the presentation, and please know that I'm always very open to constructive criticism as well as positive feedback. I really do practice what I preach, so feel free to provide honest feedback so that I can continue to improve as a presenter. And it's certainly been my pleasure to spend time with you this morning. And I know as leaders you have a very interesting set of circumstances that you're dealing with, but I know each one of you are doing your very best, and I appreciate that, and hope that you have, you know, a very successful year ahead and a very successful performance appraisal session with your employees. So again, thank you for your time.
And thank you, Jennifer. We appreciate you carving out some time for CMA. And, you know, it's definitely a very relevant topic for today's climate. And yeah, as you said, we'll be sending out a survey for feedback from everyone. And to everyone, you know, be safe out there. Appreciate your patience in the beginning as we're experiencing those technical challenges. So again, thank you for your flexibility, and thank you all. And we look forward to hearing your feedback and then putting on another CMA event for you all in the future. Have a great lunch, guys.
I'm just going to hang on for a little bit in case we have anything else that pops up.
Thank you for your patience, Jennifer.
Of course.
I think I still see 19 participants, so let me see what happens if, I'm gonna call you on your cell phone.
Okay, very good.
I'm not sure how this all works, and the IT guy left, so I gotta figure out how to end everything.
Very good. I will talk to you soon. Thank you all for the opportunity. Bye-bye.
Bye.